A very common question that I get and that I talk about a lot is whether you should rent or buy your home. In fact, this seems to be the great Canadian housing dilemma. Do you rent or do you buy, especially given the way prices are going these days in some of Canada's largest cities? Hi, I'm John Robertson. I'm the author of The Value of Simple and a blogger over at holypotato.net, and this video is going to be all about the rent versus buy decision. Now this matters and this is important because housing is the biggest purchase you will make, and it's the largest expense in most families' budgets, so it's worth spending some time to get it right. After all, if you can cut your housing costs by about a third, and you're already spending somewhere around 30 or 40% of your income on housing, well, that frees up about 10% for other things like long-term savings, which a lot of people are not doing, and which you really should be to be preparing yourself for retirement as well as emergencies. Now, it is a complicated discussion and decision because there are a lot of things that factor in. It is not as simple as comparing how much your monthly rent is to what your monthly mortgage payment is. And it's certainly not as simple as just throwing around mantras like renting is throwing your money away. So let's take a quick example, sort of an extreme, to show how this might work. So let's say that there is a house, and you can buy this house for $100,000, and we're ignoring in this very simple case all of the other expenses that might go along with this. So there's no property tax, no maintenance, no costs of any other sort associated with buying this house. You're just going to spend $100,000 and you get this house. Or you can rent this house, and it's going to cost you $1,000 a month in rent. And it's the exact same house. We're not talking about, renting a one-bedroom apartment versus living in a house. Now, this is the exact same house in this case. So if you were spending $1,000 a month, you would spend enough to buy this $100,000 house in just 100 months, just over 8 years. Or to put it another way, if you had $100,000, it would take a 12% return on that $100,000 invested in order to pay the rent. That is more than you can sort of reasonably expect to be able to make in an investment, so therefore, buying is clearly better in this case. Now, what if we took the same scenario, but instead of $100,000, it's now $1 million to buy this house. And it's the same $1,000 a month to buy it, to rent it. Well, you would spend enough to buy it in 1,000 months, which is just over 83 years. Now, I don't know if you're a fan of the human longevity movement and expecting to live well over 100 years, but if you're buying a place even as young as in your 20s, you're not expecting to be there for 83 years. So in this case, you're probably going to be better off renting it. Or to put it another way, if you had $1 million, instead of buying this house, you could stick it in a savings account, and all you would need is a 1.2% return on that $1 million, and you'd be able to pay the rent. So if you could invest it at even more, like 5, 6, or 7%, which is totally reasonable for an investment portfolio, well then you would have a lot more money to invest it, pay the rent out of the investment gains, and then have money left over. So in this case, renting is clearly better. And the lesson from this is that price to rent matters. When the house is $100,000 compared to $1,000 a month to rent, then it's better to buy it. When it's $1 million for the same $1,000 a month to rent, it's better to rent it. And the only thing that changed there was the price. So price to rent matters. At a low price to rent, like 100 times in that example, buying is clearly the cheaper way to provide shelter for yourself. At a high price to rent, like 1,000 times price to rent, renting is clearly the cheaper way to provide shelter, and alternative investments will produce more wealth for you. So in other words, take your money, invest it in something like the stock market and equities, then use the dividends from that to pay your rent when the price to rent is so extreme. And there's going to be a crossover somewhere in between these points where it sort of just makes sense to switch over from buying to renting. Now, the typical case in most time periods in most parts of the country is that the price to rent is relatively low, so it makes more sense to buy, which is where all these sort of rules of thumb and mantras come from, like rent is throwing your money away and it's better to pay your own mortgage than your landlord's and all that stuff. But it takes a bit of math to find where that crossover point is, and at some point, housing prices do get expensive enough that you cross over into the regime where it's better to rent. Now, a big question that I get is why? Why would someone ever rent a place at that extreme price to rent. After all, renting is paying your landlord's mortgage, so your landlord is going to charge a rent that's high enough to pay that mortgage, right? Well, most of the time this is true, but there are exceptions. So a big one is when there's a yield on cost comparison happening with the landlord. You might have to buy the house at $1 million today, and so that's the comparison you're looking at. Rent for $1,000 a month, buy it for $1 million. I'm going to rent it. But the landlord doesn't necessarily buy it for $1 million. They might have bought it 20 years ago when it was $100,000. And so from their point of view, they're making a decent return on the $100,000 that they put into the house. They're not considering what the house might be worth today if they were to sell it. They're thinking about what they actually paid. Speculation also comes into play here because people might be thinking that that $1 million house is going to be worth $2 million in another 10 years. And they don't care if they lose some money every month on rent and they're subsidizing a renter, as long as they get to flip this house in the future for a lot more money. They're just seeing the speculative aspect of that house. It's also possible they just never did the math. This is a great quote. It actually doesn't apply to the housing market. It's from the restaurant industry, but amateur capital backed by magical thinking and desire for fun distorts the economics for everyone. And that applies in some housing markets in Canada, where people just assume that an investment house is going to make the money without actually doing the math to see that it will, and they end up subsidizing their renters, or at least making a very low return on their investment when they could have been making a higher return elsewhere. So let's look at the cost of owning and renting a house. On the owning side, you're going to have to pay your mortgage every month. And this payment is going to consist of a principal component as well as an interest component. So the principal component is the part of the mortgage that goes towards paying down that mortgage debt, so that at the end the mortgage eventually does go away. And also part of your monthly payment is going towards interest. Part of your monthly payment is also going to have to pay for property tax, whether that's rolled into your mortgage or paid separately. I believe most people end up paying this as a separate bill. You're going to have to pay some maintenance and upkeep to keep the house in good repair, and eventually to make upgrades to it to keep it modern as the styles and fittings change over time. And this is not necessarily going to be a monthly cost like your mortgage payment. This might have no cost for several months in a row, and then all of a sudden you'll get hit with a rather large expense in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars range, depending on the particular repair that comes up. There's going to be insurance costs as well as transaction fees, and the transaction fees are usually just when you're buying and selling. Not so many on the buying side. You'll often face a land transfer tax, particularly in Toronto and the rest of Ontario. There's going to be a land transfer tax on purchase. And then when you sell, there are going to be other costs, including the realtor fees, to get it listed and sold. On the renting side, it's a little simpler. You're going to pay your rent and your tenant's insurance. And the tenant's insurance is generally a fair bit lower than the owner's insurance for a place. So if you're paying less overall, that means that you can invest the down payment that you would have put on the house, as well as any difference in costs in a portfolio. And of course, that brings another sort of hidden cost, which is the opportunity cost of the down payment. Now, I'm not double counting these. When we eventually go through the math, we're only going to include the down payment making returns on one side of the ledger. But it's something to consider that when you own a house, if you've put a whole bunch of principal into it, if you buy a house with no mortgage, just because you're not making that monthly mortgage payment doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of cost associated with that. Because you do have all of that money tied up in the house that could have been invested otherwise, that would make the renting side look better if you had that available to invest. And then whether it's in a savings account or invested, that could have been paying that monthly rent. So let's take an example. There's a house, a listing goes up, someone's got to leave for whatever reason, and they want to get out of this house. They are willing to either sell it or rent it at current market prices, and this is based on actual real listings from Toronto and the north end of Toronto in terms of the cost to rent and the cost to buy a similar 3 or 4 bedroom house. And so you step up as an owner and say, hey, I'm going to go and buy this house for $1.5 million. Or as a renter from the alternate universe. And of course, as we know from historical Star Trek episodes, the alternate universe version of yourself wears a goatee. And so both of you say, I'll take it. The renter is going to take it for $3,500 a month. The owner is going to buy it for $1.5 million. So let's look at the owner's cost of buying, what they're going to be paying out as they own this house. First, they're going to have to make a down payment of 20% in this example. So that's $300,000 that they're putting down. They're also going to have to pay the land transfer tax for Ontario and Toronto's municipal one, which comes to a total of $52,200. Now, if you are a first-time buyer, you're going to get a rebate on some of this, but of course you're going to burn that rebate room. So if you're planning on buying and then moving again in a couple of years, you're going to have used up your opportunity to use the first-time buyer rebate. And so you might want to include it as a cost even if you're not actually paying it out, because you're using up that opportunity. Whereas if you're renting for a few years and then buying your forever home in another decade or so, you'll still have that first-time exemption to the land transfer tax. There's also going to be some other smaller costs like legal, inspection, appraisal, etc. And let's say that these total up to $2,150. So in total, the owner is going to be putting down $354,350 just to get in the door of this house. And then there's going to be some ongoing costs. So they're going to have a mortgage. That's going to be $1.2 million at 3.2%. And that's the total of the principal and interest is going to add up to $69,634 over the course of the first year. So that's a full 12 months. They're going to have to pay some property tax, $10,500 for the year in this example. They're going to have to pay some maintenance. So a good rule of thumb is about 1% of the price of the house, and we'll talk about this rule of thumb in a bit later. But for now, let's use that, and that's going to be $15,000 of maintenance costs. And that's, again, not necessarily something that they're going to have to pay this year, but it might accrue. So it might be that they're not paying $15,000 this year, but then in order to keep current with the standards of the neighborhood, in 5 years, they might have to put up, $50,000 or $60,000 of renovations, as well as a number of smaller repairs to keep the house in its current state. And finally, they're going to have their insurance payment for a grand total of an annual outlay of $97,134. Now let's have a look at the renter's cost of living in that same house. They're going to have their rent as well as their tenant's insurance. The rent of $3,500 a month is going to total $42,000 over the whole year, for a total cost with the insurance of $42,420. Now, if you remember, the owner had paid over $97,000, which means that the renter had $54,714 less than the owner coming out of their pocket. So now they're going to go and invest that difference. They have a starting capital of $354,350 in their investment portfolio. That's what the owner had to pay to get into the house in the first place, their down payment, as well as those other upfront costs of buying, as well as that difference through the year that they're saving and putting to their investment portfolio of $54,714. And on top of that, their investments, these amounts are going to grow. In this case, let's assume 7%. That's going to add $26,719 to the value of that investment portfolio. So they're going to end the year with a wealth of $435,783. Let's compare that wealth to what the owner is going to have after the first year. Now, the owner started with a house worth $1.5 million, and that house value is going to increase. In this case, let's be conservative and assume that's going to increase with inflation, so it's going to go up by 2% or $30,000. Against that, the owner owes a mortgage of $1.2 million, but part of that mortgage was paid off through the monthly payments to the mortgage in the principal component, which adds up to $31,950 over the course of the year. So you add all those up, take out the mortgage owing, and the owner ends the year with a net wealth of $361,950, quite a bit less than the renter's wealth. Now, this is going to continue to play out in future years. Each of the owner and the renter are going to have a paycheck come in, and a portion of that paycheck is going to go basically into a black hole. Part of it is going to go toward rent, toward interest, towards property tax, as well as everything else they're spending their paycheck on, whether it's food, entertainment, children's sports programs, vacations, whatever. That money for the sake of argument here, is basically gone. And part of it for the owner is going to go into their house, building up their equity, paying off that mortgage principal. Whereas for the renter, part of their paycheck is going to go into their investment portfolio to help make a return for them by saving the difference in costs between renting and owning that exact same house. Now, as we move into the future, inflation is going to change a few things. So the rent is going to go up each year for the renter. For the owner, maintenance and insurance will go up, but the house prices will also go up. Also, the mortgage will get paid off, although mortgage rates may increase on renewal. So for this scenario, if we continue looking at this year after year for another 10 years, the renter's ahead by over $500,000. And that's because of the extreme difference between the house price and the house rent in this example. Over 400 times price to rent. Now, to keep going, you're going to use a spreadsheet because it's a lot of work to continue this going forward year by year, manually adding up all the numbers and speaking them out. So I've got this spreadsheet available. The link is there. If you want to pause it, you can see it on the left, and I'm going to put the link up again at the end. So you can go ahead and find this spreadsheet and use it for your own case to help analyze what's going on in terms of the difference in costs between renting and owning and where that's going to leave you after a certain number of years. Now, this comparison depends on assumptions, a lot of different assumptions, and those are going to affect the outcome. So the price to rent is a big one, and one I mentioned. The GTA and the GVA are at extremes right now. I'm recording this in 2017, and the prices in Toronto and Vancouver are off the charts in terms of how high they are. And while rents are high, they have not gone anywhere near as stratospheric as the prices have. And so that's a big factor. If you're outside of these cities, if you're particularly outside of the other major cities in Canada, you're probably going to find the price to rent is not that extreme, and it probably does make sense to buy, like it has for much of our history. How much you think your house is going to appreciate is also going to affect the outcome here. I used a inflation rate of about 2% in this particular example. And historically, houses have appreciated at something like inflation plus a bit. But if you're looking at recent history, we've seen double-digit increases in places like Toronto. If you expect that double-digit increases are going to continue into the future, then that's really going to skew your perception of which option is better toward buying. In fact, if you expect that we're going to have something like 30% year-over-year increases like we had in the spring of 2017, I mean, go out and buy as many houses as you can with as much leverage as you can, because that's clearly the way to massive wealth. Of course, the risk is that that doesn't happen, and we end up going back to houses appreciating at inflation plus a bit. And when you look at that level of inflation on the house prices that we have, it looks like renting is better. But again, this also speaks to that speculative component as to why someone would rent a house out at so much less than the cost to carry it as an owner. And it's because of that rapid increase that has been happening lately. And if you keep projecting that to continue, then you're going to not care so much about losing money on renting out the house because you're expecting to make it back on that rapid rate of appreciation. Now, rent inflation is also going to play a role. If you expect that rent is going to increase roughly in line with inflation, then you might be more favorable towards renting. Whereas if you're expecting rents to rapidly increase far beyond inflation, then you might be a little more hesitant to rent. Now, in Ontario, there is rent control now for all units, even those built after 1991, thanks to the Ontario Liberals' changes to the Ontario Tenant Act in 2017. So as long as you're staying in the same place, you're going to have rent control, and that's going to keep your rent inflation relatively low. But if you do have to move, you may face higher rents than just straight inflation. So as you look at different scenarios, be sure to include one where rent does increase faster than sort of 2% basic inflation. How much your investment portfolio returns is also going to be a big factor. If you're assuming that your only alternative to buying a house is a savings account that only returns 1 or 2%, then buying a house is going to look better than if you assume you're going to be able to invest that money in something that's going to return 5, 6, 7, or 8% in an investment portfolio. How mortgage rates behave in the future is going to be another factor. I mean, you can rather easily look up what you can get in terms of a mortgage today, but will mortgage rates be higher in 5 years when you have to renew and higher again in 10 years? Will they stay relatively flat? It's very difficult to predict. And so again, run the scenario with a few different assumptions as to what mortgage rates are going to do into the future. Maintenance and the other costs also come into play. Maintenance in particular because it's one of the more difficult ones to estimate, and because there has been some discussion as to what an appropriate rule of thumb is. A long-standing one, and one that I use as the default for my spreadsheet, is that 1% of the house's value is a relatively good rate to use. And people justifiably criticize that by saying, well, you can take the exact same house in Toronto and say London, Ontario, which is 200 kilometers away, and there's going to be almost a 3 or 4-fold difference in the value of those houses just because of where they're located. And the maintenance expense is not necessarily going to be 4 times higher in Toronto than in London, because otherwise they're the same house. And unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, because you also have to bear in mind that the standards of the neighborhood change as the prices increase. So you might start with the same sort of house that was built from the same architectural plans in the 60s or 70s, but the one in Toronto now, the standard of the neighborhood dictates a certain level of refinement for the finishing of the basement, whereas the one in London might not have a finished basement at all. The one in Toronto might have started with an asphalt driveway, but as that comes due for a resurfacing, the standards of the neighborhood might now dictate an interlocking brick driveway, or even something super fancy like a heated slate driveway to just wick away the snow in the winter. Likewise, in the kitchen, rather than using laminate countertops and plain white appliances, you might need name brand, super expensive stainless steel appliances, as well as granite countertops. And instead of doing your lawn and garden maintenance yourself, you might have to pay for a service in order to maintain the standards of the neighborhood. As these houses become million-dollar houses, they start to take on million-dollar attributes. And so that can make that 1% rule still have some validity. Now, of course, if you want to get more accurate, you can go ahead and estimate every single expense you might have with a house. What's a furnace cost? What's a roof cost? What's a basement ceiling cost? How much does it cost to redo your kitchen and your bathroom every 20 years or whatever? And add up all those costs, add up how long and how often they have to happen, and then see what your maintenance averages out to in terms of an annual cost, and use that, and that would be more accurate. But if you have to pick something, I think 1% is decent. Alex Avery in The Wealthy Renter actually advocates 2% or even as much as 5% of a house's value as maintenance, because he says people tend to underestimate how much it costs to keep a house in good order. I think 1% is a decent rule of thumb to start with, but again, please feel free to make it more accurate for your own situation. And the financial comparison is just the start of the decision as to whether to rent or buy. It is an important one and very complicated, but there are non-financial factors that you're going to have to weigh against the finances. So on the owning side, there are a number of pros. Pride of ownership is one that a lot of people mention. People simply want to own their own home, and that's fine. You just have to weigh the pride of ownership against the difference in cost. So for instance, I might prefer to own my house versus rent my house, but if I'm looking at that house in North Toronto, $3,500 a month to rent or $1.5 million to buy, I mean, that adds up to a $500,000 expense after 10 years for pride of ownership. My pride is not worth that much. You also have security of tenancy, and that's an important thing. It gives people peace of mind knowing that a landlord's not going to sell a place out from under you and force you to move. But again, keep it in mind in comparison to the costs, and also remember that this is a pro, but it's a pro, or the flip side, the con on the renting side, is one of inconvenience and not necessarily a major hit to your financial well-being and the sort of trajectory your life is taking. you can always find another rental, even if it's at a little bit of a higher cost. Whereas if you get caught in a very bad situation in a house with leverage and being forced to sell because of a divorce or job change or something, you can actually find yourself in a very bad position. Another pro to owning is that it's easier to renovate. Again, bear this in mind, keep this in proportion to the cost difference, as well as whether you're actually likely to renovate. Because if you find a rental that meets your needs, why would you want to renovate it? It's already meeting your needs. And lots of people have dreams of renovating, and they will renovate a place when they first buy it to make it fit their needs. But then after that, only the most dedicated handy person is actually out there, ripping down walls year after year and trying to change things up. Once you get the house the way you want it at the beginning, you don't tend to need to do a lot of renovations. And there is a myth out there that you can't do simple things like hang pictures or paint walls as a renter. You absolutely can. You just need to put them back the way they were, patch the holes, repaint the walls back to white or neutral beige or whatever they were when you moved in, to the satisfaction of the landlord. Another pro to owning is that you can use leverage. This cuts both ways, because using a lot of leverage, that is borrowing in order to buy, lets you buy a more expensive house, and as house prices increase, it means that you put less money down and you get to enjoy the full increase in value of the house. So when house prices increase rapidly, leverage is a really good thing to have. But it works against you if house prices go down, because then you could very quickly find yourself underwater. If you put only 10% down on a house and house prices decrease by 10%, you can't sell your house, because on top of the having zero equity, you also have to pay the realtor and everything to get out of the house. So now you need to come up with tens of thousands of dollars in order to sell your house and move, which can be very difficult for people, especially if they're already financially stretched by the cost of buying in the first place. Now on the renting side, a number of pros include flexibility. So if you have a new job offer come up, or if you get divorced and need to split and each find your own places, you can just do that. Just give your notice to the landlord, and in a couple months you are out and on your way to the next thing in life, whereas you don't have that liquidity when you own a house. There's also a lot lower risk in renting from a number of different factors. There's no maintenance risk, so you don't have to worry about a big expensive repair like a roof replacement or a foundation repair coming up. If something like that happens, it's the landlord's responsibility to fix. There's no liquidity risk or transaction fees, so that plays into the flexibility, because you don't have to pay these big fees to get out, and you're not going to find yourself underwater. It lets you have a more diversified wealth, so you don't have a one asset strategy where so much of your wealth is tied up in the housing market, and if it doesn't perform well over the next 10 or 20 years, then that means that you might not be on track to retire, or whatever it is that you might be counting on your money to do for you. It also gives you flexibility and lower risk in that you don't have to invest the difference. So you can have a much lower monthly cash flow, again, assuming the price to rent is such that you do have a lower cash flow need in renting to begin with. So if something happens and you don't have the money coming in, like you lose your job or you get sick, it lets you stay in your house. Because even though part of that mortgage payment is going towards paying down your principal, you still have to make the full mortgage payment every month, or the bank starts power of sale proceedings and kicks you out. So if you lose your job and you can't pay the mortgage, it doesn't matter that part of that was going to pay the principal before, because you can't access the principal to keep paying the mortgage when you're sick or when you're out of a job. And this is one I like to emphasize in particular because it has happened to us in our family. In case you're not aware and not a regular follower of the blog, my wife got sick with a very serious and very rare disease late last year. So now for almost a year, she's been practically out of work. We've been cut down from 2 incomes to 1, but we've been able to stay in our house because we've been saving the difference in cost between renting and owning and investing that. But once she lost her job, we still had enough money coming in from just 1 income to keep paying the rent, so we could stay in the house. It was an extremely stressful time. I can't even imagine how stressful it would have been if we were owners of this same house, because then we would have needed both incomes to keep paying the mortgage, and we would not have had as big an emergency fund because we wouldn't have had that difference in cost that we were saving and investing over the years. So if she got sick and we were owners, I don't know what would have happened. We might have had to face the prospect of not only dealing with her rehabilitation and trying to get her out of the hospital, but also putting the house up for sale because we couldn't afford to live there anymore. And that is just sort of a crazy thing to think of, but for those rare scenarios when that happens, it can be very important to have lower ongoing monthly cost commitments. And if renting gives you that lower cost commitment such that you can live on just one income if it comes to it, that can be an important source of flexibility and resiliency in your financial life. Finally, another pro to renting is that you can look to only meet your current needs. So if you're thinking of maybe having kids and you think, oh great, I want to have a house with 3 or 4 bedrooms down the road for all my kids, and you're looking to buy, you might look to buy a house that has that many bedrooms right now. But if you don't actually have any kids, or you've only got one right now, you might not need that 3rd or 4th bedroom for another 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years. So you can look to not necessarily use an apples to apples comparison. Instead of buying that 3-bedroom house now, you could rent a 2-bedroom apartment until you do need a 3rd bedroom, and then go and rent that 3-bedroom house, which lets you save even more money as a renter by just focusing on your current needs and using that flexibility to move up when you actually need to move up. So to help mitigate some of the cons against renting, here are a few hacks. First off, remember that everything is negotiable. So renters will have less security of tenancy. That's a pro to owning. But you can mitigate this in some ways by negotiating for longer leases. The standard, is particularly in Ontario, the standard is a 1-year lease. When you're first getting together with a landlord, that's almost always what's going to be on the table to begin with. But landlords want good, stable tenants just as much as tenants want good, stable places to live. And so you can negotiate for a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year lease if you want to have additional security of tenancy. And you can build in inflation increases with your landlord in the lease, however you want to negotiate that out. Sometimes landlords will even waive inflation if they get to lock you in for 5 years, which works out great for everyone. You can also negotiate improvements and renovations. Just because it's not common to make renovations doesn't mean you can't. You just have to negotiate and work it out with the landlord. You can't just knock a wall down on your own like if it was your own house as an owner. That doesn't mean the wall can never come down. It doesn't mean the kitchen can never get upgraded, or whatever renovation you want to make is. Sometimes even owners of fixer-upper houses will look for a handy tenant who will then make the renovations to the house, just like you'd make to your own house, to upgrade the house for the landlord. Then you get to go in and rent a house at the cost of a fixer-upper, eventually fix it up and get to continue living there in a nice house that you've helped fix up, and the landlord may contribute toward the materials costs. And so this can all be negotiated. Not all landlords are going to be open to this sort of thing, of course. Some of them are going to be very fixed in their mindset as to what a standard lease is and what happens in terms of improvements and renovations. But I can say from personal experience that I have worked with a landlord to improve a kitchen before by adding a dishwasher when that was something we really wanted in a kitchen that wasn't there to begin with. We've added other things to our houses that we've rented over the years, including things like railings for the stairs and improving the drywalling and trim and all these sorts of things, and they can all be negotiated. And Alex Avery in The Wealthy Renter has even more examples of cases where people have negotiated with the landlord and the clauses that they put in so that if they move out early, how they will split the cost of materials, and all that sort of thing is in there. And these are all possibilities. Also, be sure to look for a long-term landlord. If your landlord has just purchased the place that you're in, if they're not living in the city and they're just looking to flip it in a couple of years, and they might be openly honest with you about their intentions, then you might not want to live there if you're aiming to have security of tenancy for a number of years. If you're only going to be there for a few years yourself, then it doesn't really matter. And finally, find a place that you want to live in. Don't try to time the market, because I personally think there will be a crash, that this price to rent cannot continue and it will not be fixed with rents skyrocketing and doubling, that it'll more likely be fixed by property prices coming down. But don't try to rent a place and just put up with it for a couple of years until prices come down and then you can buy the place you actually want to live in, because property markets move really slow, and it's really hard to predict the timing of these sorts of things happening. So be sure, if you're going to rent a place that you actually like, that you're actually going to want to live in for a number of years, because it could be decades before the price to rent situation sorts itself out. And again, these comparisons are not including a crash happening. This is just what's happening if prices sort of flatline or continue along with inflation. Now, there are a number of common criticisms of the rent versus buy comparison, and I'm going to go through a couple of them here. One of them is that real people don't save the difference if they rent, whereas paying off a mortgage is forced savings. And to this I say, even owners have to save, whether it's for infrequent repairs, things like those big expenses that will come along to keep your house in good shape, or for their own retirement. They have to save. You can't just pay the mortgage even as an owner. So forced savings is still not good enough as an owner. So if you can't save, the answer is to call a money coach to fix your budgeting, to fix your ability to put some money away, not to call a realtor. And also, people who watch a video like this and who pull out a spreadsheet to compare the costs of renting and buying, they're not the general population. So the question is not, will someone out there, will a quote-unquote real person save the difference between renting and owning and actually come out better and wealthier as a renter? It's the question is, are you going to save and invest the difference? And if you made it this far into the video, I suspect the odds are quite high that you will do that. It also means that you have the freedom to spend on a higher quality of life instead. I already gave the example of my wife and I where she was forced out of the workplace and we were able to live on just one income. It also gives you the freedom to spend in other ways. So instead of just saving and investing the difference and building up more wealth, you could choose to spend some of that and enjoy your life more. Rather than being house poor, you could take more vacations. Rather than living in a 2-bedroom condo, you might be able to rent a full detached house, which better fits the lifestyle that you're looking for with kids and a dog or whatever, which, if the price difference is that great, that might be the difference between being able to live that lifestyle or not as an owner versus as a renter in Toronto. Another common criticism is that the owner has a paid-for house at the end of 25 years, but the renter still has to pay rent. And no matter how many times I go through it slowly and remind people of this, I still get this criticism, so now I'm addressing it explicitly. The mortgage getting paid off is explicitly accounted for in the math and in the examples above. And in this particular scenario, again, using the assumptions that I have, the renter in this case could buy that house in cash with their investment portfolio by year 13, whereas the owner will not have that house paid off until year 25. So that means that as soon as owning makes sense for the renter's free to switch. They have that big investment portfolio. They can use that investment portfolio to buy a house. Or they can continue to not buy a house and they use their investment gains in that investment portfolio, the dividends that are coming off that, to pay their rent. Just because the house gets paid off doesn't mean that the owner is automatically better off at the end of those 25 years. And also remember the other costs of owning. Living in a house is not free even after the mortgage is paid off. There's still going to be things like property tax, maintenance, and insurance. So this is not a drill. This has been a very long discussion, but this is not just like theoretical academic stuff. This is real life and what you're going to do for your own investing and your own living situation. And the amounts can be huge. Housing is usually a family's largest expense, and housing is very expensive, whether renting or buying, in places like Toronto and Vancouver. So looking at your options for housing matters. And the price to rent in Toronto and some other large cities is nowhere near normal and has not been for several years. So again, in a normal market for most of our history, you could say something like, oh, I'm just going to go out and buy a house because that's just what you do as an adult, because renting is throwing your money away, because you're just paying off the landlord's mortgage. And for most of our history, that would have been all the analysis you needed to do. But these days it's more complicated than that because we are so far from a normal market. And so it makes sense now to spend the time figuring this out and deciding whether or not it might actually be better to rent and invest the difference to be a wealthy renter rather than an owner. I put up some resources here near the bottom of the slide. The rent versus buy calculator, I showed you a screenshot earlier. You can get that from holypotato.net. And apologies for the not human-friendly way that WordPress formats my URLs. Holypotato.net / P equals 1073. More on this decision and discussion at holypotato.net / P equals 1909. And if you are looking at the examples and the kinds of returns that we're talking about, 5, 6, 7, 8%, and thinking, well, that is nothing like a savings account or GIC I have in my bank. How do I do this investing part of Save and Invest the Difference? I have a book that I've written called The Value of Simple, and also a course available at course.valueofsimple.ca that will teach you step by step how to invest and get that money working for you to make those kinds of returns over the long term.